Hello, my name is Rob and welcome to The Geek Show for another episode of Alternatives 2, in which we look at a new high profile release and suggest you alternatives. So it's not a review, we'll just get that out the way first. Today we're going to be talking about Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, put out by Activision, developed by Toys for Bobs on PlayStation and all on the family of Xboxes. Now, I've got to throw out a few honourable mentions or not quite featured mentions at the front end of this list. First things first, the first game that immediately jumped to my mind when I was thinking about what I was going to put on this list was an all but forgotten game from 2002. I think I played it on the Dreamcast called Taz Wanted. That's the Warner Brothers Taz, basically a Crash Bandicoot ripoff. There's no dressing that up. A more obvious choice, which you're probably going to be asking me why I didn't include it, any Mario title. When I do these lists personally, I like to make sure that you can play them, but at the same time, just to be obscure enough, the titles just to be obscure enough that they could function as recommendations. I mean, the very idea of recommending somebody to play Mario, it's kind of redundant, isn't it, really? You're going to play Mario whether I recommend it or not. So, the other recommendation is Klonoa, any sort of iteration of Klonoa. The reason why that one's a recommendation, it would be on the list, but I like to make sure that these games are at least somewhat accessible, that you can play them and get them somewhere. And in all good conscience, I couldn't really recommend you Klonoa when I know it's quite difficult to come by, whether on PlayStation or Wii. So, let's get into it, shall we, with our first pick. The first pick is probably the biggest of the three titles, and it is Ubisoft's best game, Rayman Legends. The reasons for this being tied to Crash Bandicoot are twofold, really. The first one is it's following a platforming legend. The original Crash Bandicoot Trilogy is a legend of a run, really. And Rayman, in its peak with Michel Ancel, was an absolute legend of a platformer. Kind of went into the Badlands of 3D action platformers Rayman for a while with the N64 and whatnot, but with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox and PC Rayman Origins, it found what it was and really doubled down on it again. Rayman Origins is a classic, and Rayman Legends is a follow-up of a classic of a franchise which is beloved and probably created one of the best 2D platformers easily of the past decade. Another aspect of it, sort of relating to Crash 4, is the ability to swap between characters. Now, in the new Crash Bandicoot, you can't so much as swap characters, as far as I can take so far from the promotional campaigns and the promotional playthroughs that they've already done. There's a cast of characters that you can play each level with, whether you can flip and flop between them on a single playthrough, or whether you have to choose before the level and sort of just commit to it as you have a run through with Crash Bandicoot or one of his many friends. I don't know. But it's two solid levels to recommend Rayman Legends, and honestly, if you've not played Rayman Legends, and you call yourself a fan of action platformers, or platformers, or puzzle platformers, just platformers in general, then really, what have you been doing? It's been one of the highlights of this past 7 years of games, I'll be honest, and it's kind of frustrating, personally, as a fan, that we've not had any follow-ups to Rayman, because honestly, it's the best thing that Ubisoft do. No real challenge to that. Moving on to number 2 is a bit of a left field turn, really, because when you think about Crash Bandicoot, you think about Saturday morning cartoons. Personally, I always think about that first level in the first game where you're running towards camera and you're jumping over all the gaps and there's a big ball running towards you. You don't think of, well, quirkiness. Even though there is a quirky sense of humour in Crash Bandicoot, it's not the immediate thing, which is the opposite of the second recommendation I'm going to be throwing here, which is Psychonauts. Tim Schafer's Double Fine studio, they've got a new one coming out some point this year or next. Looking forward to that a great deal, but Psychonauts is a puzzle platformer, early to mid-noughties, incredibly quirky. You play as a would-be psychonaut who goes into people's brains to figure out their neuroses and the neuroses are present in ways from milkmen to sort of mad theatre exposés to weird war games. It really runs the gamut, really, but the reason for the connection is it's a platformer with a huge personality. Crash Bandicoot, with its Saturday morning aesthetic, with its goofy sense of humour, with its Warner Brothers sense of humour, like the Animaniacs, is a very strong connection if you're going to sort of relate a sense of humour to a game. Whereas Psychonauts is a little bit more, I guess, Rick and Morty, but the sense of identity through comedy, the sense of quirkiness through comedy, ties them both together. Like I said, it's a very thin link. And honestly, I'm just recommending this because it's a game which divides audiences, honestly. And in a lot of cases, Crash also divides audiences. Like I said, I'm really struggling for this one. But yeah, give Psychonauts a go. The reason why I'm struggling for this one is generally Crash Bandicoot. I could just have done a list of what games to play instead of Crash Bandicoot. The Crash Bandicoot Original Trilogy? Spyro Trilogy? Really, this idea of the platformer with a mascot in, they don't really do them anymore. They're much more of a bygone thing, and the ones that are still around are either Mario, or they've been dumbed down and repackaged and kind of shadows of the former self. So the reason why you got to go a little bit more left field is because you'd just be spelling out the obvious if you didn't. And I think that's the best sort of description that describes Psychonauts, especially his place in the platform sphere. It's very, very quirky. So thin link it may be, but it's either thin link or thunderingly obvious and a little bit boring, honestly. Last one, a little bit closer to Crash Bandicoot, which will be very much appreciated, I assume, is Sly Cooper. Specifically, the most, let's just say the Sly Cooper trilogy that was released on PlayStation 3, to make it accessible, because some of these games just kind of go off, just disappear like Klonoa did. But Sly Cooper is it's a gentleman thief group of animals, very quirky sensibility, and you can swap between characters, especially later on. Big link there between Crash Bandicoot and Sly Cooper is, as the series progressed, the characters that were introduced become more colourful, more interesting, and the animals that they're incorporated were just puns, basically. But that's okay, because the animal mascot platform kind of has a history of just being puns going all the way back to the classic era. But yeah, Sly Cooper is a game which I think doesn't really get the respect it deserves, which, again, is another tenuous link, but for a long time, outside of the core fandom, before the reissue, the N.Sane Trilogy with Crash Bandicoot, Crash also was kind of divisive. It wasn't beloved in anywhere near the way it was now. It had been relegated to cultdom, and Sly Cooper is exactly the same. Beloved by a small medium community, let's just say, and it's ready for a repackaging and redesigning in the same way that they did with the N.Sane Trilogy and Crash Team Racing and Spyro and all of these things. It's ready for that, and it's ready to be rediscovered by a new audience. There's a lot which links are very slim on Sly Cooper and Crash Bandicoot in some ways, and very thick in other ways, but the kind of thick as thieves there, but that's kind of on the nose, isn't it? No, let's stay with that. As far as their history, Crash Bandicoot and Sly Cooper are thick as thieves. And there are my 3 alternatives to Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. So, just to wrap them up again, that was an honourable mention for Klonoa, Rayman Legends, Psychonauts, and Sly Cooper. The next video following on from this one is looking at the schedule, Watch Dogs Legion at the back end of the month, so that'll be a fun one full of really reasonable comments. So look forward to that later on in October. And thank you very much for watching Alternatives 2. We've been The Geek Show, and we'll see you later.